The December rain hammered the cracked pavement outside the old grocery store where Thomas Walker had taken shelter for the night. At 48, his weathered face told the story of 4 years living on the streets after losing everything in a series of devastating setbacks that had stripped away his home, his job, and his dignity. The cardboard beneath him was already soaking through, but he'd learned to endure discomfort that would have broken the man he used to be. Thomas adjusted his worn jacket and pulled his knit cap lower over graying hair that hadn't seen a proper cut in months. The shopping cart beside him contained everything he owned in the world. A few changes of clothes, a tattered blanket, some canned food, and a thermos that had become his most precious possession. 4 years ago, he'd been a construction supervisor with a steady paycheck and a small apartment. Now he was invisible to most people who hurried past without making eye contact. The afternoon shift was ending at the nearby office buildings, and well-dressed professionals rushed through the rain toward their cars and warm homes. Thomas watched them with neither envy nor resentment, just the detached observation of someone who'd learned that circumstances could change faster than anyone imagined. He'd been one of them once, rushing home to dinner and television, taking comfort and security for granted. "Excuse me, sir?" came a small voice from beside him. Thomas looked up to see 2 children standing in the rain, both around 9 years old, with identical dark hair and the kind of expensive clothes that suggested they came from a very different world than his own. The boy and girl looked nervous but determined, holding hands as they approached his makeshift shelter. "Are you okay out here in the rain?" the little girl asked, her voice filled with genuine concern that surprised Thomas. "We have some money," the boy added, reaching into his pocket. "Our mom always said we should help people who need it." Thomas studied the children more carefully. They were clearly twins, with the same intelligent eyes and careful way of speaking. That suggested good upbringing and education. But something was wrong with this picture. Why were 2 well-dressed children wandering alone in this part of downtown during a rainstorm? "Where are your parents?" Thomas asked gently, accepting the $5 bill the boy offered while scanning the area for adults who might be looking for missing children. "We're supposed to meet our dad at his office," the girl replied, "but we got lost trying to find the right building. Everything looks the same when it's raining." "I'm Sophie," she continued. "And this is my brother Alex. We just moved here from Boston after our mum died in a car accident 8 months ago." The simple statement hit Thomas harder than he'd expected. These children had lost their mother and were now lost themselves, trying to navigate an unfamiliar city while dealing with grief that no child should have to carry. "My name is Thomas," he said, making a decision that would change all their lives. "Why don't we find a dry spot and figure out how to get you to your father's office safely?" As they huddled under the store's awning, Sophie and Alex told their story. Their mother had been killed by a drunk driver while picking up groceries. On a Saturday morning, their father, devastated by grief and struggling to raise twins alone, had moved them across the country for a fresh start. He'd taken a new position, but the long hours and emotional distance that had developed since their mother's death had left the children feeling lost in more ways than one. "Dad works all the time now," Alex explained, his 9-year-old voice carrying wisdom beyond his years. "He says it helps him not think about Mum, but we think he's just scared to be home with us because we remind him of her." Thomas felt a familiar ache in his chest. He understood running from grief, understood how loss could make a person do things that hurt the people they loved most. His own downward spiral had begun with tragedy, a workplace accident that had injured his back and led to pain medication that became addiction that cost him his job and his relationships. "What building is your father's office in?" Thomas asked, pulling out a phone that was old but functional. One of the few possessions he'd managed to keep through everything. "Sterling Tower," Sophie replied. "He works on the 28th floor for something called Harrison Industries." Thomas knew the building, a gleaming skyscraper about 6 blocks away that housed some of the city's most successful companies. The contrast between these children's obvious wealth and his own situation wasn't lost on him, but it didn't matter. What mattered was getting them somewhere safe. As they prepared to leave the shelter of the store awning, Thomas noticed 3 men approaching from across the street. Something about their purposeful movement and the way they seemed focused on the children made his instincts flare with warning. In 4 years on the streets, he'd developed a sense for danger that had kept him alive in situations most people never had to face. "Sophie, Alex," Thomas said quietly, "stay close to me, and be ready to run if I tell you to." The children sensed his tension and moved instinctively closer to him. Thomas positioned himself between them and the approaching men, his mind racing. Through options, the store behind them was closed, the street was nearly empty due to the rain, and the men were now close enough for Thomas to see their faces clearly. "Those are the kids," one of them said to his companions, not bothering to lower his voice. "The Harrison twins. This is going to be easier than we thought." Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. These weren't random criminals looking for easy targets. They knew who Sophie and Alex were, and they'd been looking for them specifically. This was a kidnapping attempt, and the children's wealthy father had made them targets. "Kids, when I count to 3, run toward those office buildings and don't stop until you find security guards or police officers," Thomas whispered urgently. But before he could begin counting, the 3 men accelerated their approach, clearly realizing their cover was blown. The leader, a tall man with prison tattoos visible on his neck, pulled something from his jacket that made Thomas's blood freeze. "Nobody has to get hurt," the man called out. "We just want the kids. Walk away, old man, and pretend you never saw anything." Thomas looked down at Sophie and Alex, saw the terror in their young faces, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pure, righteous anger that burned away for years of defeat and self-pity. These children had already lost their mother. They weren't going to lose anything else on his watch. "Run," Thomas told the twins firmly. Now, as Sophie and Alex sprinted toward the office district, Thomas stepped forward to confront the 3 men who'd planned to destroy what remained of this family's world. He had no weapons, no backup, and no reasonable expectation of success. But he had something else that had been dormant for too long. The determination to fight for something bigger than his own survival. The first attacker reached him with a confidence that suggested he'd expected easy intimidation from a homeless man who looked like he'd been beaten down by life. What he encountered instead was someone who'd found a reason to stop running from his problems and start facing them. Head-on. Thomas's construction background had given him strength that for years of hardship had refined rather than diminished. His first punch connected with the leader's jaw with the force of accumulated anger and protective instinct. The man staggered backward, clearly surprised by the power and precision of the blow. "The kids are getting away," one of the other attackers shouted, starting to chase Sophie and Alex. Thomas grabbed the man's jacket and spun him around, using momentum and determination to compensate for being outnumbered. The third attacker circled behind him, but Thomas had learned to fight smart rather than fair during his time on the streets. "You picked the wrong kids to mess with," Thomas growled, landing another solid punch before the odds began to tell against him. The fight was brutal but brief. Thomas managed to delay the attackers long enough for Sophie and Alex to disappear into the business district, where security cameras and potential witnesses would make kidnapping much more difficult. But he paid a price for his heroism, absorbing punches and kicks that left him bloodied and breathless on the wet pavement as the frustrated criminals fled to avoid drawing more attention. Thomas struggled to his feet and began following the path the children had taken. His ribs ached and his vision was blurred. But the adrenaline of protecting Sophie and Alex kept him moving forward. He found them huddled in the lobby of Sterling Tower, being comforted by security guards who'd called the police and were trying to contact their father. When they saw Thomas approaching, both children broke away from the adults and ran to him with relief and gratitude that made every injury worthwhile. "You saved us," Sophie said, tears streaming down her face as she hugged the homeless man who'd risked everything for strangers. "You're hurt," Alex observed, his young face filled with concern for someone who'd put their welfare above his own safety. The security guards were professional but cautious, clearly uncertain about the disheveled man the children were embracing. Thomas understood their hesitation and began explaining what had happened while paramedics examined his injuries and police officers took statements. But the moment that would change everything came when the elevator doors opened and a man in an expensive suit stepped into the lobby with the controlled urgency of someone who'd received the most terrifying phone call of his life. "Sophie, Alex," he called out, his voice breaking with relief as he saw his children safe. The twins ran to their father, and Thomas got his first clear look at the man whose children he'd protected. Even without the expensive clothes and commanding presence, something about him seemed familiar, though Thomas couldn't place where he might have encountered someone who clearly moved in very different circles. "Sir, you're the hero who saved my children," the man said, approaching Thomas with tears in his eyes. "I'm Daniel Harrison, and I can never repay what you've done for my family." Harrison. Thomas felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind. Harrison Industries was one of the largest construction companies in the region. The same company that had been his employer's biggest client back when he'd had a career and a future. As Daniel Harrison knelt beside the paramedic examining Thomas's injuries, neither man realized they were about to discover connections that went far deeper than a random act of heroism on a rainy December afternoon. The ambulance ride to the hospital gave Thomas time to process what had just happened. As the paramedic cleaned his wounds and checked for serious injuries, he found himself sitting across from Daniel Harrison, one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. The contrast between their circumstances should have made conversation impossible. But grief and gratitude had a way of breaking down social barriers. "The police said, you fought off 3 armed men to protect my children," Daniel said, his voice still shaky from the terror of almost losing Sophie and Alex. "Why would you risk your life for strangers?" Thomas looked through the ambulance window at the city lights blurring past. "Because they're just kids who've already lost too much. Nobody deserves to lose their children." The simple honesty of the statement seemed to hit Daniel like a physical blow. For the first time since the phone call that had sent him racing to the lobby, he really looked at the man who'd saved his family. Beneath the worn clothes and weathered features, he saw intelligence, dignity, and a kind of strength that had nothing to do with money or position. "You said your name was Thomas Walker?" Daniel asked. "That's right. Were you ever in construction? Your name sounds familiar." Thomas hesitated. His past felt like another lifetime, and he'd grown accustomed to being invisible. But something in Daniel's tone suggested genuine interest rather than casual curiosity. "I was a supervisor for Mitchell Construction until 4 years ago. We did a lot of work for Harrison Industries." Daniel's eyes widened with recognition. "Tom Walker, you were the supervisor on the Riverside Mall project. I remember now. You caught that structural problem that could have brought down the whole north wing." The memory hit Thomas with unexpected force. The Riverside Mall had been one of his proudest achievements, a complex project that had required innovative solutions to challenging engineering problems. He'd found a critical flaw in the original plans that would have caused catastrophic failure within 5 years of completion. "That was a long time ago," Thomas said quietly. "Not that long. For years, you said." "What happened?" Thomas found himself telling the story he'd never shared with anyone. The workplace accident that had crushed 3 vertebrae in his lower back. The prescription pain medication that had become his only relief from constant agony. The gradual escalation from pills to stronger substances when the prescriptions ran out. The missed workdays, the declining performance, the inevitable termination. "I lost my apartment 6 months after I lost my job," Thomas continued. "Lost my truck a month after that. By the time I realized what was happening, I was too far gone to stop it." Daniel listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood both the technical aspects of construction work and the personal devastation of watching a career collapse. When Thomas finished his story, they sat in silence for several minutes. "The addiction?" Daniel asked finally. 2 years clean," Thomas replied. "Being homeless is a lot of things, but it forces you to face your problems without anywhere to hide." At the hospital, Daniel insisted on staying. While doctors examined Thomas more thoroughly, The injuries were painful, but not serious, mostly bruises and cuts that would heal within a few weeks. As they waited for discharge papers, Sophie and Alex sat beside Thomas's bed. Their young faces filled with an earnestness that reminded him why he'd been willing to fight for them. "Thomas," Sophie said, "Dad told us you used to build buildings." "That's right. Could you build us a treehouse?" Alex asked. "Mum always said she'd help us build one, but then she died, and Dad's too sad to do fun things anymore." The innocent request landed like a knife in Thomas's chest. These children were dealing with loss in the same way he'd been dealing with his own trauma. By focusing on small, manageable goals that might bring some joy back into their lives, Daniel cleared his throat, clearly struggling with his own emotions. "Kids, Thomas has his own life to worry about. We can't just ask him to actually," Thomas interrupted. "I'd be honored to build you a treehouse, if your father doesn't mind." The next few hours passed in a blur of police interviews, insurance, forms, and the kind of bureaucratic processing that followed any violent crime. The attackers had been arrested 6 blocks away, their abandoned van containing evidence that suggested the kidnapping had been planned for weeks. Detective Rodriguez explained that wealthy families were increasingly targeted by organized crime, rings that specialized in ransom operations. "They knew your children's schedules, Mr. Harrison," the detective said. "Someone's been watching your family for a long time." The realization that Sophie and Alex had been in danger for weeks without anyone knowing sent a chill through both men. If Thomas hadn't been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, the outcome could have been catastrophic. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Daniel faced a decision that would define the kind of man he wanted to be. Thomas had saved his children's lives, but more than that, he'd reminded Daniel of something he'd forgotten in his grief. That there were people in the world who acted with courage and compassion, even when they had nothing to gain from it. "Thomas," Daniel said, "I have a proposition for you." "What kind of proposition?" "I need a new head of construction safety for Harrison Industries. The position requires someone with extensive field experience, someone who understands the challenges of keeping workers safe on complex projects." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Harrison, I appreciate the gesture, but you don't owe me a job. I did what anyone would have done." "No, you did what you chose to do, and that choice tells me more about your character than any resume ever could." Daniel's voice carried the conviction of someone who'd made an important decision. "The position pays $90,000 a year, plus benefits. You'd have your own office, a company car, and the authority to shut down any project that doesn't meet safety standards." The offer was so far beyond anything Thomas had dared to hope for that he couldn't immediately process it. $90,000 was more than he'd ever made in his life, enough to rebuild everything he'd lost, and more. "Why?" Thomas asked. "Because my children are alive, because you were willing to fight for them, because you understand what it means to lose everything and find the strength to keep going. And because I need someone in that position who will never compromise safety for profit." Sophie and Alex had been listening to the adult conversation with growing excitement. "Does this mean Thomas can build our treehouse?" Sophie asked. "It means," Daniel said, smiling for the first time since his wife's death, "that Thomas is going to be part of our family's life for as long as he wants to be." The transition from homelessness to corporate employment happened with surreal speed. Within a week, Thomas found himself in a furnished apartment paid for by Harrison Industries, wearing new clothes purchased with an advance on his first paycheck, and sitting in meetings with executives who treated him with the respect due to someone who'd saved their boss's children. But the real transformation began when he started spending time with Sophie and Alex. The treehouse project became a weekend ritual that gave all three of them something to look forward to. Daniel often joined them, and slowly the grief that had consumed him since his wife's death began to make room for moments of genuine happiness. You know? Daniel said one Saturday afternoon as they worked on the treehouse platform, "I'd forgotten what it felt like to build something with my hands." Thomas looked at his new friend, a man who'd shown him that success didn't have to change someone's fundamental decency. "Your wife would be proud of the father you're becoming again." The comment hit Daniel hard, but not with the devastating pain that had characterized his grief for months. Instead, he felt something that had been missing since the accident, a connection to the man his wife had loved and the father she'd wanted him to be. "She would have liked you," Daniel said. Sarah always said you could judge a person's character by how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them. As autumn turned to winter, the treehouse took shape in the massive oak tree behind the Harrison family's estate. It wasn't just a children's playhouse, it was a masterpiece of construction that showcased Thomas's skills and creativity. Multiple levels connected by rope bridges, solar panels for LED lighting, and a pulley system for hauling supplies up from the ground. More importantly, it became a symbol of healing for a family that had been broken by tragedy. Sophie and Alex spent hours in their treehouse, playing games and having conversations that helped them process their grief. Daniel found himself joining them, rediscovering the joy of simply being present with his children. The professional relationship between Thomas and Daniel evolved into something neither man had expected, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared values. Thomas's safety innovations saved Harrison Industries millions of dollars in potential liability, while his leadership style earned him the loyalty of workers who'd grown cynical about corporate management. "The men trust you," Daniel observed during one of their monthly reviews. "They know you've been where they are." "Experience is the best teacher," Thomas replied. "You can't understand construction safety from a conference room." But the most significant change was in Sophie and Alex themselves. Having Thomas in their lives gave them a male role model who combined strength with gentleness, someone who understood loss but hadn't let it destroy his capacity for love. He taught them practical skills like woodworking and basic mechanics. But more importantly, he showed them that adults could be counted on to keep their promises. "Thomas never says he'll do something unless he means it," Sophie told her father one evening. "Not like the other grown-ups, who promise things and then forget." Daniel realized his daughter was talking about him, about the promises he'd made and broken in the depths of his grief. The observation stung, but it also motivated him to become more intentional about being present in his children's lives. The first Christmas after Sarah's death had been unbearable, a grim reminder of everything the family had lost. But the second Christmas, with Thomas as part of their extended family, felt like a new beginning. He joined them for Christmas Eve dinner, bringing handmade presents he'd crafted in his workshop. Small treasures that showed the care and attention he brought to everything he did. "I have something for you too," Daniel said, handing Thomas an envelope. Inside was a deed to a small house on 5 acres of land adjacent to the Harrison estate. The property included a fully equipped workshop and a view of the mountains that stretched to the horizon. "I can't accept this," Thomas said, though his voice betrayed how much the gesture meant to him. "You saved my children's lives," Daniel replied. "This doesn't come close to repaying that debt, but it's a start." Thomas looked at the deed, then at Sophie and Alex, who were barely containing their excitement at the prospect of having him as a permanent neighbor. For 4 years, he'd lived with the constant uncertainty of not knowing where he'd sleep, or where his next meal would come from. Now he was being offered not just security, but a home and a family. "There's one condition," Daniel added, with a smile. "Sophie and Alex get unlimited access to your workshop. They want to learn how to build things." That spring, Thomas moved into his new home and began the project that would define the next phase of his life. With Daniel's encouragement and financial backing, he established the Walker Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping homeless veterans transition back into stable employment and housing. "You understand their situation in a way that most people can't," Daniel explained as they reviewed the foundation's business plan. "Your story gives them hope that recovery is possible." The foundation's first client was a former Army medic named James Carter, who'd been living on the streets for 2 years after losing his job due to PTSD symptoms. Thomas recognized something of himself in the younger man's eyes, the combination of pride and desperation that came from watching your life spiral out of control. "I'm not looking for charity," James said during their first meeting. Good, Thomas replied. Because I'm not offering charity. I'm offering you a chance to earn your way back. Within 6 months, James was working as a safety inspector for Harrison Industries and living in a small apartment funded by the Foundation's transitional housing program. His success became a model for helping other veterans navigate the complex challenges of rebuilding their lives after trauma. The Foundation grew rapidly, attracting attention from other corporations and philanthropists who wanted to support its mission. Thomas found himself speaking at conferences and congressional hearings, sharing his story and advocating for policy changes that would make it easier for homeless individuals to access job training and mental health services. But the work that mattered most to him remained personal. Every evening, he returned to his house next to the Harrison estate, where Sophie and Alex would run to greet him with updates about their day and plans for new projects. They'd grown from traumatized children into confident teenagers who carried their mother's memory with pride rather than pain. Thomas taught us that losing someone doesn't mean you have to lose yourself, Alex told a school counselor who was helping him process his grief. He showed us that sad things can happen, but you can still choose to do good things for other people. Daniel had found his way back to being the father Sarah would have wanted him to be, present and engaged with his children while still running his business with integrity and success. The guilt that had consumed him after his wife's death had been replaced by a determination to honor her memory through his actions. On the 5-year anniversary of Sarah's death, the family held a memorial service in the treehouse Thomas had built. As they shared memories and lit candles in her honor, Daniel reflected on how much their lives had changed since that rainy December day when a homeless man had chosen to risk everything for 2 lost children. Sarah would be amazed by who we've become, Daniel said, looking at his children and his closest friend. She always believed that good things happen when good people choose to help each other. Thomas nodded, thinking about the chain of events that had led him from sleeping under store awnings to running a foundation that had helped hundreds of people rebuild their lives. Your wife was right. Sometimes one moment of courage can change everyone's entire story. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the treehouse and the land they all called home, Sophie made an observation that captured the essence of what they'd built together. We're not the same family we were before Mum died, she said. But we're still a family. Just a bigger one now. That night, as Thomas sat on his porch looking across the field toward the lights in the Harrison house, he marveled at the journey that had brought him here. 4 years of homelessness had taught him that rock bottom could be a foundation for building something better. Daniel's friendship had shown him that success meant nothing without people to share it with. And Sophie and Alex had reminded him that love multiplied when it was given freely to others. The phone rang, interrupting his reflections. It was James Carter, the first veteran the foundation had helped, calling to share news that he'd been promoted to site supervisor and was getting married in the spring. I wanted you to be the first to know, James said. None of this would have happened without you giving me a chance. You earned it, Thomas replied. All I did was believe in you. After the call ended, Thomas walked to his workshop, where he was building a rocking chair for James's future nursery. As he worked, he thought about the letter he'd received that morning from another corporation wanting to replicate the Walker Foundation's model in their city. The movement was spreading, creating opportunities for people who'd given up hope of ever having a normal life again. But the real measure of success wasn't in the statistics or the recognition. It was in moments like this, working with his hands, to create something beautiful for someone he cared about, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to make a difference in people's lives. When he finished for the evening, Thomas locked the workshop and walked back toward his house. Through the windows of the Harrison home, he could see Daniel helping Alex with homework, while Sophie practiced piano. It was a scene of ordinary family. Life made extraordinary by the knowledge of how close they'd all come to losing each other. As he reached his front door, Thomas paused to look up at the stars visible above the city lights. Somewhere out there, other people were facing the kind of darkness he'd experienced during his years on the streets. Tomorrow, the foundation would help some of them find their way back to the light. It had taken a moment of violence and the courage to protect 2 children for Thomas to discover that his real purpose in life wasn't building structures out of steel and concrete. It was building hope out of despair, creating families out of strangers, and proving that redemption was always possible for people willing to fight for something bigger than themselves. The homeless man who'd saved the Harrison twins had found something more valuable than money or success. He'd found a reason to believe that every ending could be a new beginning, and that sometimes the most important thing you could build was a bridge between who you used to be and who you were meant to become. As Thomas Walker settled into bed, in his comfortable home, surrounded by the evidence of a life rebuilt from nothing, he felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd learned the difference between surviving and thriving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve others, but tonight, he was exactly where he belonged. The story of the homeless hero and the Harrison twins had become something bigger than any of them had imagined. It had become proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose compassion over indifference, courage over fear, and love over loss. And in a world that often seemed dark and hopeless, that was the most valuable lesson of all. The end.